It was still dark in Mason City, Iowa, on the morning of June 27, 1995. Most of the city was asleep, but for Jodi Huisentruit, that hour was part of her routine. She was a morning news anchor at KIMT-TV, and like so many people who worked early broadcast shifts, her day started while the rest of the world was still quiet.
But that morning, Jodi did not arrive at the station on time. A coworker called her apartment. Jodi answered and reportedly said she had overslept and was getting ready to come in. That may have been the last known conversation anyone had with her.
Soon after, there were signs outside of her apartment that something had gone terribly wrong. Her car was still there. Personal items were found scattered near the vehicle. Investigators believe she had been abducted before she could leave for work.
Jodi was 27 years old. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a journalist, and a familiar face to viewers in northern Iowa and southern Minnesota. More than 3 decades later, her case remains one of the most widely discussed missing person cases in the Midwest.
Tonight, we are taking a careful look at the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit. What is known, what remains uncertain, how the investigation has evolved, and why this case still matters.
No problem. All units
I'm
at
at the corner of Pleasant Hill and John Young Freeway.
And joining us is Daniel, a volunteer with Crime Solvers Central. Daniel has followed this case closely, has worked around missing person case awareness, and has firsthand knowledge of the way this case has continued to affect people who want answers.
Daniel, thank you so much for being here with us today.
And thank you guys for having me. So this case has affected a lot of people for a very long time. Jodi's name, it still matters, and the hope for answers has never gone away. They just had a vigil recently down in Mason City to commemorate the 31-year anniversary, and the lead detective on her case says that they continue to receive and pursue leads as if it was still yesterday, which is good because it just shows that Jodi's name has never gone away, and it never will, hopefully at all, but certainly not until she's found and brought home. So.
Now, before we get into the timeline, I want to talk about Jodi as a person. You know, it's easier in older missing persons cases for the details of the investigation to overshadow the person at the center of it all. So, Daniel, when people talk about Jodi, what stands out the most to you?
Well, I will say that I never knew Jodi. She disappeared a year before I was born. But my family, I have family members who knew her because she was from the same general area that I was from in Minnesota. And it's important to know, I think, that Jodi, she's become this sensation recently. She's known as, quote, the missing news anchor from Mason City, Iowa. And that's not necessarily who she is. She was a person. She was a daughter. She was a friend. She was a niece. She had siblings and parents and goals and aspirations. She was not just this, missing person. She was a young woman with ambition, warmth, a strong professional goals in mind. She grew up in Minnesota. She pursued broadcasting, and she was a visible, journalist down in Iowa. And she even had stints back in Minnesota for a while, and then ultimately ended up in Mason City. She had friends, coworkers, families. She had a goal. Who knows where she would be today. And I just want to make, the point to emphasize we want to humanize her. Before we start talking about evidence and anything else that goes along with the typical missing persons case. So that's, I think, one of the most important things.
Yeah, absolutely. She was only 27 years old. Now, that matters very much. She was building her life, her career. She had already reached a place where the community recognized her, but she was still so young and still growing, and she had so much ahead of her.
And you did mention that her role on local TV made her different from a lot of missing persons cases. She was known by the public. People saw her on television, and a lot of them felt like they knew her, even if they'd never met her before. Do you think that visibility helped the case? Do you think it complicated it? Or do you think it's a mix of both?
Those are great questions. Now, the first thing I want to make absolutely clear is that I'm not involved in her case in any way. I'm not a private investigator. I'm not, assisting police in any way. I'm just a person who cares. So as I answer questions, I want to just bear with that in mind. So I would say from my interpretation of the media and what's been said by the police, I would say it was a combination of them, because she was this face that was in everybody's living room or kitchen every single morning for a while. People felt like they knew her. This was before the days of smartphones and everything where you could just find the news online. Like, people watched the news every single morning to find out what was going on. She was on television. They felt like they knew her. Even if they had never met her. You're absolutely right. I would say that the visibility definitely spread her name quickly. When they heard Jodi's missing, that immediately sent shockwaves throughout the Midwest. And it's kept the case alive, which is a good thing. It's also prime for creating rumors and public theories and intense speculation on certain people. So for someone who's on TV, there's the question of, what did they develop an unhealthy fixation? Was she the victim of a random attack? We're not sure. Ultimately, only one possible avenue, and it should be handled carefully. Because like we said at the beginning, we want to, humanize her, solve the case as quickly as we can, and go from there.
And I think one of the difficult things about this case is that her public role naturally raises some questions. Was she targeted by somebody who knew her personally? Was she targeted by someone who watched her? Was it someone local? Was it someone who knew her routine? Those questions, I think, have followed the case from the very beginning.
And we also know that because she worked those early mornings, her routine was unusual. She would be leaving for work when the streets were quiet, when there were fewer witnesses, and when a person waiting outside might have had less of a risk of being seen.
Now let's walk through the known morning timeline carefully. Jodi was scheduled to work the morning broadcast at KIMT. When she did not arrive, a coworker called her. Jodi answered and said that she had overslept and she was getting ready.
And that detail is chilling because it places her as alive and aware that morning. She hadn't vanished overnight without contact. She was home and she was preparing to leave. She was expected somewhere. And then within a very narrow frame of time, something happened.
Daniel, from an investigative standpoint, why is the call so important?
So that call narrows the window, okay, because it establishes that Jodi was indeed alive at that point, and she was preparing to go to work. I know that she received her first phone call and said, "Oh, I'm in a shower. I'll be there in 20 minutes," and then hung up. And then she wasn't there in 20 minutes. And then they called again, and no one answered, and she doesn't show up for work. So it means that anyone who is responsible likely knew her morning routine and the time she left for work, and took advantage of that early morning window, or they acted during a very short opportunity and had an insane amount of luck and caught her right at that time and left little to no evidence behind. But that's helpful because it gives investigators a time frame, almost to within like 20 minutes. Because after that call, she was fine, and then but something happened to her before she could successfully leave for work.
And we also know that when authorities later arrived at her apartment complex, they had found signs that supported the belief that she had been abducted near her vehicle. There were items reportedly found near the car that had become part of the public memory of this case, her keys, shoes, personal belongings, and they were scattered in a way that suggested a sudden struggle.
And the car itself was still there. That matters. If Jodi had simply left voluntarily, her car likely would have not remained in the lot with those signs around it. The scene pointed investigators away from a voluntary disappearance and toward foul play.
Now, Daniel, when you look at the scene details that have been publicly reported, what do they suggest to you?
Well, just that. I mean, from what I've seen based on what the police have reported and on the documentaries that the family and the police have done, there were drag marks in the silt in the parking lot, and her earrings were found. I believe a bottle of hairspray, a hair dryer, a hair. From what I understand, nobody knows really who the hair belongs to, and there was a partial palm print left on one of the light poles. So all of those signs, to me, scream abduction. And it appears that as she was leaving, close to leaving, possibly at or near her car, when she encountered someone and she was attacked. And another thing is the mirror of her car was bent forward. So possibly like she was attacked from behind, maybe crashed into the mirror. Nobody's sure. The scattered belongings obviously suggest a intense disruption in the way she was going about her morning. Again, everybody should avoid speculating on what's already been publicly confirmed. Those things that I mentioned have been publicly confirmed. Law enforcement has treated the case as an abduction. And one other thing that I should mention is that witnesses did report at around between 4 and 4:30 that morning, they heard a scream in the parking lot. They also are right next to a campground, so the witnesses didn't think anything of it at the time. However, now that they've had time to think about it and they know what happened, they believe that was Jodi crying out during what were ultimately her final last moments, which is incredibly sad.
Yeah, I agree. That is incredibly sad. And those details have been discussed for years, but like many witness details in cold cases, they have to be handled carefully. Memories, times, and interpretations can all become very complicated.
Exactly. We can say that the early morning timing, the items near the car, and the fact that she never arrived at work, and the condition of the scene led investigators to believe Jodi was abducted. And this is the core of the case.
Now let's talk about Mason City, 1995. This was not a case unfolding in a massive city where being anonymous is expected. Mason City is a smaller community. Jodi's disappearance hit people hard because it felt close and personal.
Now, Daniel, for people watching who aren't familiar with Mason City, why does the setting matter?
That's a good question. It matters because in a smaller city, people would usually assume that they're safe or that someone, would notice unusual activity. And Jodi's disappearance absolutely challenged that sense of security that everybody relies on. I mean, it also means that relationships, routines, local knowledge become especially important. Someone familiar with the area may have known when she left, where she parked, and how quiet the apartment complex would be at that hour. And just in the spirit of full disclosure, I took a weekend trip a few weeks ago down to Mason City because I just wanted to see for myself, what is this small town like? And I walked by the site where she was taken from, and it is unbelievably eerie to think that happened right there, because you feel like everybody in the town knows you and wouldn't do this to you. And then when all of a sudden that changes and there's this person who does something like this, that disrupts every resident's sense of small town security and peace. And I think that's really stuck with people to this day.
And that raises one of the biggest questions in this case, and that is, was this planned?
And if it was planned, how much did the person know? Did they know Jodi's schedule? Did they know her car? Did they know where she lived? Did they know that she would be leaving before dawn?
Or was it an opportunistic crime that happened because she was alone at the wrong moment? That possibility has been considered in public discussions, though many people come back to the idea that the timing seems extremely specific.
So, Daniel, when you think about the possibility of opportunity versus planning, what do you think we should be careful about?
Well, that's good because I think this is where a lot of traditional true crime discussions tend to go off the rails. You know, the caution is to not turn a hunch into a fact. Okay, nobody has facts, at least not that has been publicly reported. It may have felt planned because the timing was narrow and the location was oddly specific. So that certainly, suggests that somebody knew where she lived and what time she would be leaving. But investigators have to prove that. And a person could have known her routine and through personal contact, through observation. They see her walking into her apartment through her public work schedule. Somebody could have known that when she gets done in the afternoon, she's free and they see her go home, or just by random chance. The evidence has to lead to the conclusion and not the other way around. So there have been all kinds of speculations that it was this person who did this at this time because they knew it. Well, the burden of proof is on that person at that point to prove that. And if you can't prove it, then it's not worth laundering into the media because it's not helping the case. It becomes difficult to separate fact from fiction at that point. What's a good way to describe it? It can put innocent people in danger, ruin reputations, and a lot of other things that we don't want to happen absent proof.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. The day and evening before Jodi vanished have also received a lot of attention. Public timelines have discussed her activities the previous day, including a golf event and time spent with some people that she knew.
And one frequently discussed detail is that Jodi reportedly spent time that night before with John Van Cise. He was a friend who had said that she came over to watch a videotape from a birthday gathering he had arranged for her earlier that month.
John Van Cise has been publicly discussed for years in connection with this case, including as a person of interest. Now, it's important to say clearly that he was not charged in Jodi's disappearance.
Now, Daniel, how do you feel a responsible panel should discuss people whose names are publicly connected to the case, but who were never charged?
Yeah, that's a great question. The approach is to be factual and cautious and fair. It's completely fair to say that someone is publicly discussed, interviewed, investigated, or identified in reporting as a person of interest if that is indeed accurate. And in this case, it is accurate. John Van Cise was very active in front of the cameras in the immediate aftermath of Jodi's disappearance. And then when he realized, I think, what that media attention was doing, he completely backed away from the cameras and refused to speak with investigators any further. So we shouldn't call him guilty, even or imply his guilt, or build a story that outruns the evidence. It remains true that Jodi was good friends with John. They palled around together, did all kinds of outings, and they would meet with friends at local bars, and he was known for owning a boat. He would take her water skiing with other friends. Those are all facts that have been publicly established. And I think it does establish that John was a good friend of Jodi's. But from there, we can't imply anything else because there was never any evidence to suggest that he did anything. Everything else is conjecture. In Jodi's case, multiple people have been discussed publicly over the years, yet police have never been able to find any evidence in order to convict anyone, including John Van Cise. And it should be known that he did pass away at the end of 2024.
That distinction matters. True crime and missing persons coverage can easily become reckless. But the goal here is to not accuse. The goal is to understand the known timelines and ask what information could still help investigators.
And the timeline we know of the night before remains important because it might help identify Jodi's state of mind, who she was with, what her plans were, and whether anything seemed unusual before the morning she disappeared.
There have also been public reports that Jodi had concerns before her disappearance. Some accounts say that she had reported or mentioned feeling followed, including references to a man or vehicle These details have become part of the broader discussion around whether someone was watching her.
Now, when you hear that a missing person had prior concerns about being followed, how do you feel that should be weighed?
Well, it should be taken seriously, of course, but not treated as proof of who was involved. I don't even know if the police know who was the person who was following her. The stalking concern, they're really relevant, especially since this person has not been seen in 30 years. I mean, if she made a police report that she thought somebody was following her, which she did as late as October 1994, then of course that's relevant, but it's not automatic proof pointing at a person who may have been involved. So investigators, of course, would want to know who was following her and whether that vehicle could be identified and whether the reports were documented and whether her friends or coworkers noticed anything else. But it is also possible for separate events, meaning this case and her abduction, to appear connected and then later on be determined that they weren't connected at all in hindsight. Weirder things have happened.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Once someone disappears, every prior uncomfortable moment can feel like a clue. Some may be clues, others may not be, and sorting all of that out is the difficult part.
That's true, but if someone listening knows anything about Jodi expressing fear, being followed, receiving unwanted attention, or having a troubling interaction before June 27th of 1995, that kind of information could still matter.
More than 30 years have passed. Jodi has never been found. No one has ever been convicted, and yet her case is still alive and active in the public consciousness.
Now, Daniel, much like your own interest in this case, why do you feel other people have followed it so closely?
For many reasons. And this is a good opportunity, again, I think, to segue into, humanizing Jodi. Why have people followed it so closely? Because Jodi, the person, was young, she was visible, and she loved life. If you just look at any pictures of her, she's always got this big smile on her face. Like, nothing can steal my joy. That's kind of the interpretation I have of her, even though I never met her. And the fact that she was abducted in just such a terrifying way in what seemed like a normal moment of her day, leaving for work. I think that combined with the fact that she was a high-profile person is the reason that it's stuck with people so long, because they think to themselves, that could be me, that could be my daughter, that could be anybody I know. The scene suggested violence, but there's no body, there's never been a trial, and there's no final answer. There's been no closure for her sister, for her niece, for anybody who cares about her. She had so many people who did. And the lack of resolution keeps people searching. And groups like Find Jodi, that's a nonprofit 501c3 that's committed to keeping her name in the public eye. Journalists and missing person advocates have kept her name in front of the public, all in an effort to solve this case, which I think is very helpful, because it's just, if you think about it, it's terribly tragic because a lot of people want to see this case resolved. But there are important people in her life who never did get to see this case resolved. Her mother spent, I forget how many years it was after Jodi was taken, and never knew what happened to her before she passed away. And there are plenty of other people in that same boat who wanted to see resolution, but never did. And I think that's a big part of why this case is stuck with people, is they want to know what happened to her before they are not with us anymore.
Yeah, that's such an emotional weight. Imagining that one ordinary morning can become the dividing line between life continuing and a family never having answers.
And for families of missing people, that uncertainty is its own kind of suffering. There's no clean ending, and every anniversary comes back, and every new lead raises hope and fear at the same time.
Yeah, Jodi's family has lived with that for decades. Her friends, her coworkers, and community have lived with that too.
And that's why we feel raising awareness responsibly still matters.
So now we're going to move into a deeper question and answer section. Daniel, we're going to ask you the timeline, the people publicly connected to the case, the investigative challenges, and role of media coverage, and what may still be possible after all of these years.
And for viewers, a reminder, this case remains unsolved. No one has been convicted for Jodi's disappearance. When we discuss persons of interest, public theories, or investigative developments, we're doing that carefully and with respect for the legal facts.
The purpose is not speculation for entertainment. The purpose is awareness, context, and the hope that someone with information may finally come forward.
So, Daniel, let's start with the timeline. When you explain Jodi's case to someone who's never heard of it before, what are the first 3 timeline points that you want them to understand?
Well, first, just let me say that thank you guys for running this podcast so responsibly, because I can't let what you guys said go by without responding to it. The fact that we're honoring Jodi, not engaging in speculation and going on fishing expeditions is very helpful, I think, because it's the endless possibilities, the theories, and just the thinking out loud. That's ultimately what I think ends up hurting the family and friends a lot. So I just wanted to put a little nugget in there to say that I think this case is being handled very respectfully on this platform. So just wanted to acknowledge that. But in regards to your question, someone who's never heard the case before, first 3 timelines points we want them to understand. Well, Jodi was expected at work extremely early in the morning, and June 27th, 1995 was a day that was no different, or so she thought. From what I remember from the docuseries that they did, she was expected at work, I believe, around 2:30 in the morning. Now, that's the middle of the night. Most people are sleeping at that point. And the reason she would be doing it then is because that's when she does her writing. She does her news for the day. She would call, local places to, she would call the police department to get police reports and everything so that they could report on. They would research the weather, all these things. So that's why she was expected there so early that morning. And when she wasn't there at her usual time, her coworkers initially thought, okay, she's been late before. But then when a half hour went by and she did not arrive, a coworker called her and Jodi said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I overslept. I'll be on my way." Okay, fair enough. That's happened before. And then third, after that, she never made it to the station. And the evidence near her vehicle, as we discussed earlier in the show, suggested that she was abducted outside her apartment. And ever since then has been one of the greatest mysteries in the Midwest when it comes to a missing persons case. Nobody knows what happened after that point, and it's been investigators' goal ever since to find out what happened.
So how narrow is the likely window between the phone call and the apparent abduction?
Well, it appears to be pretty narrow. I'm not going to go on record commenting on an exact time. I think the time is public information, but I don't remember what that is. I think it was shortly after 4 a.m. she was called. She answered and she was fine. And then when they called her again, I think it was half hour to 40 minutes later, she did not answer. So I believe the window is less than an hour. They know that she did not arrive when she said she was going to, within that 20-minute window. So I would say it even shortens it further. Minute by minute is really hard to pinpoint, especially since, again, this is 1995. You don't have cell phones back then. You can't track somebody. You can't just pick up your phone and say, okay, this is where this person is at this time. You have to, actually take the time to dial it. And every second matters in those cases. And in this case here, it was literally life and death for Jodi.
Why do you feel it matters so much that it's such a narrow window of time?
Well, because it suggests that the person who's responsible for it may have acted at a very specific time. They might have known when she was about to leave, may have been waiting, or may have encountered her during just a brief opportunity. They happened to be in the area at the time and acted on impulse. And it also helps investigators evaluate witness statements, vehicle sightings, phone records, alibis, all these things. And, it should be noted that there are things that the police likely have observed about the scene, and there are details that are known only by the police and the abductor. And that's not withholding public information, or not withholding information. That's by design, because police use that in order to verify credible witness statements, credible sightings. They use that as leverage to be able to tell, okay, who is telling the truth and whatnot. And I think that's really smart, even though it is frustrating for us as citizens who want to see this case resolved.
Yes. And speaking of the scene, what do we know about the scene near Jodi's car?
So based on public reporting, her personal items were discovered near the car. I believe we touched on a few of them earlier, but I recall that there were earrings, a bottle of hairspray, and a hairdryer that were found scattered near the scene. Now, those are extraordinarily random items. Is consistent, I would say, with what Jodi said when she woke up in a panic, got out of bed, probably grabbed as many things as she possibly could in order to fix herself up at work. And then when she was taken, all of those things got scattered all over the parking lot because she was surprised from behind. So obviously signs near the vehicle are consistent with the struggle. Her car was left behind. And the authorities concluded early on that morning that this was not a voluntary disappearance, but an abduction. Because, like I said, they also found drag marks in the silt in the parking lot, and her mirror on her car was bent forward. And those have been publicly connected by investigators to the signs of the struggle.
Now, when talking about crime scene details like this, what do you feel people should be cautious about when discussing it?
The most important thing would be to avoid embellishing details. So the lead investigator on the case says that when details like that get laundered and are over-embellished and overdone, so to speak, well, that can lead people down the wrong path. It can make people believe information is confirmed, yet it's not. So all of the things I mentioned have been stated by investigators as the facts of the case that are public facts. However, details like, embellishing have led less careful podcasts to report that there was blood found at the scene. There was no blood found at the scene. Investigators have been very vocal about saying that. There was never any bloodshed found at the scene. But, if you're not careful, as unfortunately a lot of content creators have been, then those details can easily lead people down the wrong path when it comes to this case. So it's important to avoid, exaggerating things. Details have been reported for decades, and not every version online, like I said, is equally reliable. Stick to what's been reported by the police. Reputable journalists who coordinate with police, established case awareness groups like Find Jodi. Find Jodi is very good about keeping the facts straight. They're a very reputable source. Some evidence, like I said, is being held back by investigators for purposes of solving the crime. And if they go on record with those things, it could taint a future prosecution, or it could make it even more difficult for the person to tell what they know. So investigators are playing a poker game. They're keeping their cards close to their chest by design, because if they reveal them to everybody, well, then you run the risk that you're not going to win the game.
So do you think the person responsible knew Jodi's morning routine?
That is certainly a very strong possibility. Even though we might think that with near certainty, it simply can't be stated as fact. I would say that all of the publicly stated facts so far point in that direction, but it can't be stated, yes, for sure. The person may have known her routine, personally observed her, learned it from her public work, or simply just, like I said, encountered her by chance. The timing is suspicious, but you need evidence to prove that it was planned. And so far, since police, as we've established, have not been able to establish any suspects, nailing down that evidence has been uniquely difficult for the past 30 plus years. Now, it's gotten easier over time with new developments in DNA and other incredible breakthroughs when it comes to solving crimes, but it still hasn't proven to be enough in this case so far as we know. I think it's the third time we've mentioned now that there is evidence probably that is being held back by investigators for purposes of solving the case.
Now, what do you think is the most misunderstood part of the timeline?
Well, that's a good question. I would say there are a number of them. One of the ones that I would say is most plausible is that the idea that because the timeline is so narrow, that the case should have been just easy to solve. And the fact that she was stalked by somebody while the case should have been easy to solve. A narrow window helps, and knowing those things, from the past few months of her life help. But if there's no witnesses or so few witnesses, extremely limited forensic evidence at the time, because DNA was just super brand new back then. And most importantly, there's been no recovered body. It can still be extremely, extremely difficult. Early morning crimes can leave investigators with often very little. And one of the little stated facts of this case that I feel like it's important to mention is that there were no security cameras in her parking lot outside her apartment building. We think about that now. We see a security camera and we don't think twice about it. But if there had been a security camera in that parking lot at the time, that could have made things a lot easier to solve. But since there wasn't, and we're operating with little to no evidence, it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. It truly is.
So Jodi was a television news anchor. How do you think that changes the way people look at this case?
Well, her public role means, like I said earlier, that many people felt connected to her. This was before the age of social media, where your favorite content creators are on a little computer in your pocket. Oftentimes people feel connected to the people who talk to them in their kitchen every morning. And if there are individuals who live by themselves, for example, and even if you didn't live by yourself, you felt connected to the people giving you the news because they were a constant face and a constant presence in your house every day. It also raises questions about whether someone who watched her may have fixated on her, become so intensely attracted to the idea of getting to know her or wanting to be her or any other limitless possibilities. They could have fixated on her, but it's important not to assume that her job caused the crime. It's one investigative avenue among many others that we could go down.
Do you think that because she was on morning television, her schedule might have been easier to learn?
To a large extent, yes. Viewers knew she appeared on early morning broadcasts. And if you're there early in the morning, ready to give them the news right at 6 a.m., you had to have done some amount of prep work prior to that. And this was long before the days of work from home. So if you're ready with the news right at 6 a.m., then that means that you were probably in the studio several hours before. And anyone familiar with local television would understand that anchors have to arrive before airtime for that reason. But knowing that she worked mornings is different from knowing exactly where she lived and when she would leave.
So do you think that local fame can create a false sense of familiarity?
I would say so. The people who watch the news, they see someone every day and they feel like they know them personally, even though they don't. Most people, I would say, understand the boundary, but in, rare cases, someone may, like we were saying, develop an unhealthy fixation on this person. And again, that's a possibility to consider. It's not been a proven fact. There are just any number of possibilities that could have happened in this case, and there's no ability to prove a fact as far as we go without the evidence. But yes, I would say that is one possibility of many.
What do you feel investigators should ask, or what do you feel that they should focus on when a missing person had a public-facing job?
I would say they'd want to look at, unwanted contacts. For example, the report she made to the police feeling like she was being stalked. Any letters, phone calls, viewers who showed up at the station and people who asked about her schedule, people seen near her home or where she worked, and any other complaints about harassment or stalking. And it's impossible to cover all of that in the time that we have today. But if you do go onto Hulu and watch the documentary Her Last Broadcast that was released last year, the police do go into a lot of those details as much to every extent that they can. So I would encourage anybody to watch that docuseries.
Absolutely. And about the reports of her feeling like she was being followed or feeling uncomfortable, how important are those reports?
They could be important, absolutely. I mean, it could be the key that solves the case, but it also might not be. If Jodi believed someone was following her before she disappeared, then that could point toward, this pre-abduction or surveillance or harassment. But the challenge becomes identifying whether those incidents are connected to the abduction at all. And as far as the public knows, there's no way to prove that at this current moment.
Now, about the reports of her feeling followed, what kind of information from the public do you think would still be useful?
Well, anyone who remembers Jodi talking about being followed, so, her friends at the time, receiving calls, having an encounter, noticing a vehicle, well, report it. There's no harm that can come from reporting something. The police sort out whether it's a credible tip or not. Even if you think police already know, it's better to make sure. Small details matter when they're compared with other information. Now, this is difficult because it's 30 plus years ago, but search your mind. Did you see something or hear something, whether it was from her or from somebody else, that could lead to solving the case? Well, report it. And nothing comes of it. The worst that can happen is the police go on with their day, and so do you. But the best that could happen is that it brings her home.
What about the people who lived near the apartment complex at the time?
It's hard to say. I mean, they may still hold those memories. I mean, certainly the people who lived there probably are stuck with that on their conscience for the rest of their life. It's been known that there wasn't anybody who thought anything of it. They just thought the noise was due to campground banter, and that wasn't true at all. But, unfamiliar vehicles, seeing somebody loitering, repeated appearances by the same person, any loud noises, comments made, all those things. Memories that seem small, even if you were that person in the other apartment who thinks you may have seen or heard something but doesn't know whether it has anything to do with it, please report it, because if it matches other evidence, that can be a missing puzzle piece in this case, and that can ultimately lead to solving it.
A number of names have surfaced publicly over the years. One of the most discussed has been John Van Cise, who knew Jodi and reportedly saw her the night before she vanished. How do we discuss that responsibly?
Well, you report or state only what is publicly known and supported. John knew Jodi. He was discussed publicly in connection with the investigation, and he was not charged. It's really important to avoid calling him the perpetrator. There's been no evidence of that. Again, I'm going to refer to the docuseries. If you were to watch that docuseries, it outlines a number of other names that have been discussed in the public now with the case. I'm going to avoid mentioning their names on here, but there was a man in prison in Minnesota who was in jail who was discussed in connection with her case. There was another man who lived in Minnesota at the time, was the ex-husband of one of her best friends, was now being discussed in connection with the case. And it's even a possibility that a serial killer who was active in the Midwest at the time may have had something to do with it. Those are all publicly discussed persons of interest with the case. It's not just John Van Cise. What is known about John Van Cise is that he knew Jodi. He was older than her. He liked to be around her. He thought she was a great person. and that in recent years he stopped talking to investigators up until the point that he passed away. So yes, it's important to avoid labeling not just John, but anybody as the perpetrator until the evidence is there to support it.
Yeah, it's very true. And, even after years of being investigators, even after some have already been cleared, why do you feel certain names become attached to cold cases for decades?
Well, it's usually because of the proximity, the timing, I would say inconsistent public perception, the activity in the investigation, or I would say the biggest one is the media focus. John was right there in front of the cameras the day of the abduction. In fact, it has been publicly reported that John, while the parking lot was still being examined, drove up in a truck and reported to the police, "I was the last person to see Jodi alive." The media has just capitalized on that, labeled him a suspect without the evidence being there. Just saying that, I mean, it certainly raises suspicion, that's true, but that doesn't automatically make you the perpetrator or the suspect. Once a name becomes associated with a case, like John's name has, it remains in public discussion even without charges. And that's why caution is necessary, because we don't want to name anybody as the perpetrator or even as a suspect. Police have been open. There have been no suspects without proper evidence.
So you had mentioned other names that have been discussed in connection with this. How should viewers process those newer claims or names?
That's a good question. So like we discussed earlier, and I will repeat this till I'm blue in the face, that viewers should understand that there is a major difference between a person of interest and a suspect. They are not the same thing. And it's not the same as being charged or convicted in this case. New claims need to be evaluated by law enforcement and not tried online. Now, if law enforcement brings a name forward and labels somebody as a person of interest, well, then that means that there is reasonable suspicion to think that, okay, this person may have been involved. The police need to make that determination, not people like us. Public attention certainly helps, and that's what we're here for. But public accusation can destroy innocent people, and it can, like we were saying earlier, damage investigations, which is exactly what the police have been hoping to avoid.
And now that we're on the subject of, proper terminology, what is the difference between a lead, a theory, and evidence?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm actually going to quote one of the investigators on the docuseries as saying, he says, most of the calls that they get in Jodi's case these days are theories. And he says, we don't go digging up parking lots or anything based on theories. We have to have evidence of that in order to do something like that. A theory is your interpretation of something and a possible explanation. Now, evidence is something that can be tested, it can be corroborated, it can be documented, and it can be used to support a conclusion of either a crime or something else. A strong case needs evidence and not just theories, because theories can be disproven, whereas evidence, it's much, much harder to do that.
That is a great answer. So why might police keep some details sealed or private for so long?
Yeah, so we kind of talked about this earlier, but it's mainly to protect the integrity of the investigation. If only the perpetrator knows certain facts, for example, like something that was in the parking lot that maybe wasn't reported or photographed, those details can be used to evaluate the sincerity of their confessions and used to corroborate other people's tips or witness statements. Releasing too much of that can make it harder to separate, real information from completely false claims. And there are a number of examples I could give from other cases where police have used those tricks in order to nail a perpetrator. And if they give up the ghost now, even after all this time, well, then that runs the risk of this case staying as it is. So they have to keep their cards close to their chest.
In recent years, there have been renewed searches and renewed public attention in the case. What does that tell you?
Most importantly, it tells me that the case has not been forgotten. It will not be forgotten. I believe, in the docuseries, the Mason City Police Chief says, "I'm just waiting for the day when my entire schedule falls apart because there's a breakthrough in this case." People haven't forgotten. Mason City has not forgotten. Independent parties are still receiving information that they think are worth checking. Find Jodi is the best example. And even if a search doesn't produce a public breakthrough, it can rule things out for the police and help refine the investigation, which I think is really helpful.
So how should the public interpret a search that doesn't result in an immediate arrest or discovery?
Well, a search is not necessarily a guarantee of a result. So there have been a number of searches over the years in Iowa, in Minnesota most notably, and the docuseries outlines where some of those have been done. It may be based on a tip, a theory. If investigators look at your theory and it aligns with other evidence they have in the case, well, then they may use that to execute a search or a specific, investigative need. If nothing's found, it doesn't mean that the search was pointless. It just means it eliminates an area or it tests a claim. If they're looking in a place that they can cross that off their list. Unfortunately, there are far more places to cross off than there are places that she could be. But any little bit helps. But again, you have to have evidence in order to go digging something up. You can't do it just based on theories.
That's very true. And now, are there any other details about the case that you feel more people should be made aware of?
A really important detail to note is that it has been publicly confirmed and reported, I should say, that a witness that morning reported to police that there was a mysterious-looking white van in the parking lot. Now, a white van was not common, apparently, in her apartment parking lot. Nobody, I think, was reported to have owned one. So the fact that it was seen idling there in Jodi's apartment building parking lot at 2:30 through 4 something in the morning is mysterious, and it adds to the endless amount of possibilities of what could happen to her. It's also been reported that there was a man seen walking on the bridge near her apartment building in the days leading up to it, carrying some sort of bag. They thought that, okay, maybe this guy had something to do with it. Has it been proven? No. They just thought, okay, with the addition of the white van in the parking lot and that man seen lurking in the days leading up to her disappearance, those are important things to consider. So if you're a Mason City resident in 1995 and you saw any of those things, if you saw that man anywhere else, if you saw a white van in a spot where it shouldn't, report it to the police. The worst that could happen is it corroborates nothing. But again, I'll say it again, the best thing that could happen is it's a missing piece that investigators need that leads to solving the case.
And do you feel like a decades-old case could still be solved?
Absolutely. I won't go into too many details on it because viewers can read for themselves, but just look at the case of Jacob Wetterling out of Minnesota. He was a 27-year cold case in Minnesota, and investigators worked quietly, privately, behind the scenes, out of the media attention, and they ended up getting Jacob's killer to confess and lead them to his body. So I think that's probably one of the greatest examples of how older cold cases like this can be solved. And Jodi, I believe that everybody has reason to hope and certainly expect that at some time in the future that this case will ultimately be one of those cases. Yes.
What kind of tips do you think could break open a case like this after all of these years?
I would say, what kind of a tip? Well, we're a lot further scientifically than we were even in the 90s. Cold cases can be solved through DNA, new witnesses, deathbed statements, changes in relationships, recovered evidence, genealogy, all sorts of things. A person finally coming forward. Those tips make a difference. And it even could be someone who heard a confession, someone who saw something suspicious that morning, someone who helped the perpetrator dispose of evidence. The perpetrator, no doubt, probably has a family and has people who know. Those people, should come forward. and someone who saw anything connected to Jodi, someone who knows, most importantly, where her remains or evidence may be located. Even just a secondhand statement can matter if it can be corroborated with what law enforcement has in their files.
So this case has been covered by local media, national outlets, podcasts, documentaries, advocacy groups. What are the benefits of having that kind of coverage?
Coverage like that keeps Jodi's name from fading into the background, into obscurity. It reaches people who may not have been ready to talk at the time, but are ready to talk now. And it just reminds, certainly Mason City, but the communities around the country who knew her, that this case still matters and that tips are still wanted and that the police are not giving up on this case. They are determined to find it and see it through to its conclusion. The lead investigator on the case has openly stated that he has dedicated his entire career to finding out what happened to Jodi Huisentruit. And that kind of coverage and commitment absolutely keeps her name alive, which I think is truly a wonderful thing.
Now, on the other hand, what are the risks of that kind of coverage?
Well, there's always rumors that can spread, false accusations, misinformation, straight up disinformation, and people who treat the case like content or entertainment, fodder to be used. Its families can be hurt by careless coverage, and I know Jodi's family absolutely has. They've been very open about the hurt that has resulted from careless people who just throw things around. This is a person who had a family and friends that loved her. Investigators, on the other hand, can be just flooded with low-quality tips and sending them on wild goose chases that takes away valuable time and effort from legitimate evidence and progress in the case. Responsible framing is critical in cases like these. You can't just throw things around. You can't throw rumors around without evidence to prove it as fact. And unfortunately, a lot of people have done that on similar platforms to this one, and that's not right. Families can be hurt by that, and they shouldn't be.
And talking about that kind of responsibility, what kind of role can a site or a podcast like Crime Solvers Central play in this?
Platforms like Crime Solvers Central can help by organizing the information, factual information, keep the awareness active, put her name out there, state the publicly stated facts, and appeal for information. Direct people toward the correct authorities. The Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, always looking for tips. The Mason City Police Department, always looking for tips. And it provides a respectful place for case summaries like Jodi's and tip awareness. It certainly should not replace law enforcement, but it can help connect public attention into action, which in a case like this can make all the difference.
Now, what should viewers avoid doing?
Most critically, don't harass people. Don't accuse people online. Certainly don't contact family members asking for information. Don't spread unverified claims and claim it as fact. Don't trespass or conduct amateur searches in unsafe and unlawful ways. Send tips through proper channels. Send them often straight to the people I just mentioned, the Department of Criminal Investigation in Iowa, or straight to the Mason City Police. They'll make sure that if it's a tip that's worth investigating, that investigator will have that in their hands in no time flat.
Thank you. And Daniel, we've talked at length about evidence and timelines, but I want to pause again on the human side. What happens to a family when a loved one disappears and there's no answer for decades?
Families live in just a state of unending suspended grief. I mean, they may believe that their loved one is gone, and in this case, almost all the evidence certainly points to that. But without answers, without her body, without a trial, without accountability, perpetrator, there's no resolution in the case. Every anniversary, like the one we just passed, June 27th, reopens that wound for that family. And every lead can bring hope to them and dread all at the same time. That's a weird dichotomy because you have this hope in your heart that this is finally going to be the one that solves the case, only to that be paired with a sense of dread because how many times have we felt this before? And that's just a terribly sad situation to be in.
Yeah, and that's definitely something that people miss sometimes is that a cold case is never cold to the family.
That's very true. And in long unsolved cases, there's always the question of what might have been missed early on. And that doesn't necessarily mean negligence. It might simply mean that technology was different 30 years ago. Resources were different. And the first hours of a case can be chaotic and critical.
So, Daniel, what are some things that investigators today might look at differently than investigators in 1995?
Well, today, there most obviously have been far greater advancements in things like DNA. The smallest little bit of DNA can lead to cracking a case and solving it, which is just mind-blowing if you think about it. There's better digital case management, improved behavior analysis, mapping tools, surveillance awareness, most notably security cameras, and more experience with stalking-related crimes. Stalking awareness has gone up exponentially in the last number of decades. It's worth mentioning 1995 had limitations. There were fewer cameras, or in Jodie's case, no cameras, less digital data, no smartphones, and different forensic capabilities. But that also, it leads to different possibilities because smartphones, like you didn't have one back then. You didn't just pick up a smartphone and look up where Jodie lives. You get on the payphone and you call information and you find out where she lived that way. So if the person who was the phone operator at the time answered that call, then they may have information that can solve the case. And I think it's important that that person come forward if they haven't already.
Now, do you think that old physical evidence can still be useful?
Well, certainly, yes. I think it's been well established in a number of cases that have been solved that old evidence, no matter how old it is, some things never change. I would say depending on how it was collected, how it was stored, and whether modern testing can be applied, yes. Many cold cases have advanced because evidence that seemed limited years ago became useful later, and that's one of the greatest things that detectives in the early days did was save evidence because they knew that as science evolved, that this is going to be important no matter what. The only evidence I know that's been publicly reported in Jodie's case has been that of the hair and of the partial palm print. Now, if they can match that hair, provided it was of the perpetrator, and the palm print to the same person, that puts a person at the site of the abduction, which is crucial evidence. And back then, the possibilities for going down those avenues were far more limited. With what we've seen lately, it's certainly possible. We just need the right person to come forward and make a report.
And what about witness interviews? Could those still matter decades later?
100%. Relationships change, people change, your loyalty changes, fear level changes. So someone, for example, who may have been intimidated into silence back in 1995 may realize, you know what, I'm not as scared right now, and it's time for me to do the right thing. And they may be willing to talk now. Someone may have dismissed something back then, but now realize, oh my goodness, that could matter. That could lead to solving this case. I should report that.
It's true. That's a major point. People often assume if I knew something, police would have asked me already, but that may not be true.
Well, that's absolutely right. And even if they were asked, they may remember something different now, or they may have held something back. For example, how many times have you guys thought the first time somebody asked you a question, you thought, oh, this is my answer. I'm fairly sure of that. But then as time has gone by, you think to yourself, in hindsight, well, actually, this might be my answer. Those differences in answers can mean all the difference when it comes to solving a case. The important thing is to contact the proper authorities rather than, certainly don't post it online. Share it with the authorities first, and then after it's been verified, share it with people you trust rather than publicly, because the investigators will make the findings public if it's worth doing so. If you decide to be the person to make it public, well, then that's doing what we don't want to do. That's speculating. And that can create rumors, which we've already discussed we don't want to do in cases like this.
So, Daniel, you've worked as a volunteer with Crime Solvers Central, and you have firsthand knowledge of how missing person cases are researched, shared, kept visible. What has Jodi's case taught you?
It's taught me just truly how personal it can become. Like I think I said this at one point, just imagine if this was your own daughter, your own sister. Would you want that person to fade into the background or become this online sensation? And the answer is no. It's taught me that while there can be a lot of inauthentic people out there, there are also a lot of really good people out there who want to see this case resolved. And it just hits a lot closer to home for me because it happened in the Midwest, which is where I'm from. It just so happens, that a lot of people that I knew also knew her. Whenever I talk about her case with anybody, everybody always says, "Oh, yes, we heard what happened to Jodi," or "Oh, yes, we knew Jodi. She was this wonderful person." I have yet to hear anything negative ever be said about Jodi. It hits home for me in that way because it feels like she could be anybody's sister. She could be anybody's mom, anybody's friend. That's just who she was.
So what's one thing that you wish every viewer understood about Jodi's case?
Well, I've said it before and I'll say it again, and I know the family repeats this as well, that Jodi is a real person. She's not this mystery character. She's not this sensation. She's not the missing news anchor from Iowa. She was a person who had a job, had a family that loved her, and had goals and aspirations, just like we all do right now. Someone knows something, and even after decades, the right information could still matter. So if you're that person, if you're listening today, or if you know that person, the right time to come forward was yesterday, but the next best time to come forward is today. So we would encourage you to do that.
One of the most haunting parts of this case for me is just how ordinary and normal the day should have been, right? You wake up, you get ready, you go to work, you come home. It's a very normal routine.
And for Jodi, someone interrupted that routine in the most violent way. And that's why the case stays with people. It feels like it happened in a space where people expect safety, outside the home, on the way to work, in a familiar parking lot.
And it also reminds us of why missing person awareness matters, because time passes, people move away, witnesses age, memories fade, but the need for answers does not ever fade for the family.
As we close, we want to focus on action. This is not just a story from 1995. This is still an open missing persons case. Jodi Huisentruit is still missing, and information is still needed.
If you have direct information about Jodi's disappearance, about the morning of June 27th, 1995, about suspicious activity near her apartment, about someone who made statements afterward, or about a possible location connected to Jodi, please contact the proper authorities.
You can reach out to the Mason City Police Department. You can also contact Iowa's Missing Person Information Clearinghouse. If your information is urgent or involves a possible location of remains or evidence, do not post it publicly first. Get it to law enforcement.
You can also provide tips or case information to Crime Solvers Central. Crime Solvers Central is both the name of this YouTube channel and the website. Our goal is to keep cases visible, organize information responsibly, and help to direct attention toward the people and agencies that can act on credible tips.
But we want to be very clear. Crime Solver Central is not a replacement for law enforcement. If you have evidence, a confession, a location, or first-hand information, contact authorities first.
Daniel, what kind of information should someone send to Crime Solvers Central versus law enforcement?
So law enforcement should get anything that you think contains evidence, right? So names, most notably, locations, confessions, physical evidence, vehicles, witnesses, or anything else that involves possible remains, report that to the authorities. Crime Solver Central, on the other hand, can receive awareness-related information, public source corrections. So if you've read something and it needs to be corrected, we can report the correct information based on the facts. Family-approved updates. I know that there's a Facebook page called Jodi's Hope, where the family aims to do a lot of this, correct erroneous information about the case, naturally to humanize Jodi. So follow that Facebook page and we can share updates from the family. Timeline clarifications or information that helps keep the case page accurate. But serious tips that you think could lead to solving the case should always go to the police.
So, Daniel, after everything that we've discussed, what gives you hope that Jodi's case can still be solved?
Cold cases are solved years later all the time. For example, we see updates on the Charlie Project almost every day of another missing persons case that's marked as resolved. It is possible. It does happen. Cold cases are solved years later. People come forward, evidence gets retested, investigators revisit old leads, people give different answers, public pressure keeps the case from disappearing. That's certainly true of this one. And the fact that Jodi's name is still being spoken after more than 3 decades, that means that there's still a pathway to come forward and do the right thing. Always.
What do you want viewers to remember when they leave this video?
Humanize Jodi. Remember her as a person. Remember that her family is grieving her and they want answers. Remember that small information might matter, even if you don't think it will. And remember that responsible awareness, not just speculating on theories, responsible awareness can help. Reckless speculation, on the other hand, can hurt. Do the right thing and raise awareness in a responsible way, but don't speculate.
And if someone watching now knew Jodi, worked with her, lived near her, saw something, heard something, was told something, what should they do?
2 words, report it. Even if it feels old, even if it feels wrong, even if it feels incomplete, you're unsure, be honest about what you know and what you do not know. Let investigators determine whether it matters or not. I'll be totally honest, in the spirit of full disclosure, I've submitted a tip to the police myself. I'm not going to go into details on it here, but I never heard back from them, so I would assume that investigators went a different direction. But I know that in my heart, I did the right thing by not keeping it to myself. Because what if the investigators did follow that lead and it led somewhere? I felt a lot better knowing that I submitted it and reported it rather than just keeping it to myself. So if that's you, and if you think you would have even more valid information, do it. Law enforcement will sort out the details from there.
Jodi Huisentruit disappeared doing something ordinary, leaving for work before dawn. She was 27 years old, building a career, loved by family and friends, and known to viewers who welcomed her into their homes during the morning news.
For more than 3 decades, her disappearance has remained unresolved. But unresolved does not mean forgotten. Her name is still spoken. Her case is still shared. Her family still deserves answers.
And to anyone with information, this case does not need more rumors. It needs truth. It needs courage. It needs someone to come forward with the detail that helps investigators move one step closer to finding Jodi and holding the responsible person accountable.
Contact the Mason City Police Department or Iowa's Missing Person Information Clearinghouse with direct tips. You can also visit Crime Solver Central, the website and YouTube channel, for case awareness and updates.
Daniel, thank you again for joining us, and thank you so much for the work that you do with Crime Solver Central.
Well, thank you guys for helping to keep Jodi's name out there, and that's most important, and that's what matters. So keep doing that, and we appreciate it. And I know Jodi's family would too.
And to everyone watching, please share this episode respectfully. Someone may know something. Someone may remember something. Someone may finally be ready to talk.
For Jodi, for her family, and for every missing person still waiting to be brought home, thank you for watching Crime Solver Central.